You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Your burger is served, and this is our finest Pepsi Zero Sugar. Its sweet profile perfectly balances the savory notes of your burger.
That is one perfect combination. Burgers deserve Pepsi.
Shopping is hard, right? But I found a better way. Stitch Fix online personal styling makes it easy. I just give my stylist my size, style, and budget preferences. I order boxes when I want and how I want. No subscription required. And he sends just for me pieces, plus outfit recommendations and styling tips. I keep what works and send back the rest. It's so easy. Make style easy. Get started today at stitchfix.com/Spotify. That's stitchfix.com/Spotify.
In January 1965, The Rotarian, official magazine of the Rotary Club, published a curious article by one David MacDonald relating a somewhat obscure tale of buried treasure in Nova Scotia called The Strange Case of the Money Pit. In it, he relates a story about a little uninhabited island in Mahone Bay called Oak Island, shaped, quote, like a question mark, end quote, said to have formerly been haunted by pirates, and about 3 children in 1795 who supposedly discovered signs of buried treasure there. A piece of ship's rigging hanging from a tree above a clearing with a depression in the ground. As they dug up the spot, they found further indications that something was buried there, including wooden platforms every 10 feet. And the article showed an illustration bringing this money pit vividly to life. Though the boys failed to reach any treasure in their dig, their story inspired future treasure seekers, and in the early 19th century, a more well-funded excavation renewed their efforts, finding further indications of buried treasure nearly 100 feet below ground, including a stone that was said to be inscribed with a message indicating that millions of pounds of gold were buried not far below. Before they could reach this promised booty, though, their pit flooded with water, and despite all efforts to bail it out and continue digging, they were sunk, so to speak. Almost 50 years later, some of the surviving boys brought in a syndicate and financed a third dig with more sophisticated machinery, such as a horse-driven auger that would drill down and draw up material it cut through. And during the course of their boring, they claimed to have entered some sort of a vacuum, like an empty chamber, and then to have drilled through wood and metal, suggesting they had cut into what sounded like loose metal. They believed they had drilled into treasure chests, and as proof, their auger brought up 3 golden links of a chain. Realizing that their shaft was flooding with salt water and rising and falling with the tide, they searched a nearby beach and found structures they identified as box drains that lined up with their dig site, suggesting that their money pit was not just naturally filling with water. No, it was booby-trapped with man-made flood tunnels, and the colorful diagram in the magazine piece illustrated these as well, to give the reader a clear picture of what even the men themselves could not see. Though the syndicate also failed to find their treasure, local fame of the potential find grew, and decade after decade further attempts were made, each with its further tantalizing discovery to draw treasure hunters on. One group in the 1890s put red dye into the flooded pit and claimed to have mapped the flood tunnels by finding where the red dye emerged into the sea. During this time, treasure hunters also claimed to have brought up traces of gold and a scrap of parchment bearing India ink through core drilling. Another group that included Franklin D. Roosevelt made a failed attempt to find something there in 1909. Further efforts are described in the article through the 1950s, each group spending tens of thousands of dollars and coming away empty-handed. But David MacDonald had truly struck gold in telling the tale, as his article was condensed and reprinted that month to a wider national audience in Reader's Digest, appearing in numerous books and TV series about mysteries, and becoming the subject of more than 50 books that focus solely on the Oak Island mystery itself. This was the real treasure to be had, and the History Channel seized it, producing a reality TV program that followed the latest team of treasure diggers to descend on the island, the Nagina brothers. That 2014 program, The Curse of Oak Island, ran for 11 seasons and still has not officially been canceled, though they too have never turned up any treasure. Surely, though, with this long history of claims and so many publications and docu-series examining and researching the story, there must be something to it, right? Right? This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I've learned never to underestimate the resilience of totally bogus and long-refuted claims, especially when the History Channel is involved. Thank you for listening to the Oak Island Scheme. Part 1. The Legend of the Money Pit. Before we start the episode, I want to thank my new patron, Yanua Seli. Thanks so much to all my patrons. Patrons of the show get access to a special feed with ad-free and exclusive episodes. I typically release a patron exclusive during each off week, making this a weekly podcast for patrons. For example, after my first episode in my recent series on pre-Columbian transoceanic contact theories, I released an exclusive about the 1421 hypothesis, the unfounded claim that Chinese explorers landed in the Americas before Columbus. And after the second part of the same series, I recently released another exclusive about claims that Basque fishermen and a joint Danish-Portuguese expedition did the same. If you hear the word minisode and think these pieces are insubstantial, they're actually fully produced and researched episodes, usually around 10 to 15 minutes in length, and sometimes longer. Patron feeds also get episodes early, and as mentioned, their episodes aren't interrupted by advertisements or Patreon pitches like this, which instead only include thanks to new patrons. So visit patreon.com/historicalblindness and support the show. Or you can support what I do with a one-time gift donation at historicalblindness.com/donate or at the PayPal link in the show notes, or on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Now, on with the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. Considering the nature of the stories I tell in this podcast and the topics I research, I often find myself using the words legend and myth. Sometimes it may seem that I use them interchangeably, but there are in fact important differences in their use. Both are used to refer to traditional stories or popular beliefs that have developed about someone or something. Additionally, both myths and legends are typically viewed by those who transmit them as ostensibly historical. They are traditions recounting things that supposedly really happened in the past, even when they may seem manifestly fictional or fantastical, as is the case with most ancient myths. While there is an alternative definition of a myth as an unfounded or false notion, a sense in which I also often use the term, this does not mean that all ancient mythology is entirely false or fictional, as many may have some factual basis, which I mentioned in the previous episode with regard to the person to whom King Arthur myths may refer. However, because the word legend more specifically denotes a story regarded as historical, although not verifiable, we might more accurately refer to Arthurian legend rather than myth. One further connotation, however, is that myths refer to more ancient stories of this kind, whereas legends are of recent origin, making them kind of myths in the making. When it comes to the story passed down to us about Oak Island, then, while I am tempted to call it a myth because elements of it have been credibly debunked, and because the weight of evidence indicates that the idea there is even a treasure there is false, nevertheless, because it is of relatively recent origin and some parts of it may not be entirely made up, I think calling it a legend is more accurate. Now, some listeners may think the 1700s, when the story began with the Money Pit's discovery, and the indications that its purported treasure must have been buried a century or more before that, makes it old and quote-unquote historical enough to consider it myth. But in the grand scheme of things, especially when it comes to myths and legends, that simply wasn't so very long ago. Less than 250 years have passed since the clearing in the woods was supposedly first identified as the location of buried treasure. Because of the discoveries said to have been made at the pit throughout the 19th century, some listeners may presume that there must be strong enough evidence supporting the claims about the Money Pit that we might move this story from legend into the more rarefied realm of a quote-unquote historical mystery. But in that, they may be surprised.
I would say virtually none. As far as actual historical evidence, I would say there's none. And that often surprises people if they dig into this topic, that there is no historical documentation for this story. It's a legend.
That's friend of the show Sean Munger, historian, author, podcaster, teacher, and YouTuber.
There are no books, there are no letters. Everything that has worked its way into a book is folklore. I heard from so-and-so, or it has been said that, or, the old timers say that. They're just, recordings of oral traditions.
You may remember Sean from my episode on the Holy Grail legend. He has generously offered his time to chat with me again about this topic, a longtime favorite of his. Check out his 4-part video series on Oak Island, Fool's Gold. I highly recommend it. Thanks for joining me, Sean.
Sure. Well, always a pleasure to be on. I'm one of your biggest fans, as you know, so great to be back.
You'll be hearing from Sean throughout this episode. As no treasure has ever been found, and only guesses and fictional stories have been put forward about who supposedly visited this island in the past and buried something there, the start of the story, which we must examine first, is the tale of 3 boys who discovered something. The names of these boys are given as Daniel McInnes, Tony Vaughn, and Jack Smith. And already we can find some discrepancies in the spelling of McInnes's name, sometimes spelled with an ES and sometimes with an IS, sometimes with a G, as in McGinnis. In MacDonald's Rotarian article and in other versions of the tale, the boys are said to have paddled over to the island in boats. And there are intimations that the island was entirely uninhabited. Indeed, it appears that legends of phantom lights and ghosts prevent mainlanders from even venturing out there, something that frustrates the boys' efforts to get help in digging up their pit. The boys are said to have noticed a ship's pulley on a tree branch. By the time of the Rotarian article, it's said that this tackle block was on a sawed-off branch hanging over a depression in the ground, and an illustration depicts it that way. But in the earliest versions of the story, it's actually said to have been a, quote, large forked branch, end quote, with no indication of the branch having been cut. This shows the way the story has changed over the years. Likewise, most versions say the depression was 12 or 15 feet, but earliest versions state that it was only 7. Obviously, the pulley was seen as a sign that something had been lowered into the ground at that spot. And considering rumors of pirate activity, the 3 boys got to digging into the clay earth. And it's said that they even saw the old marks of pickaxes as they dug. At 10 feet deep, they struck a platform of aged oak logs. At 20, they struck a second such platform, and at 30, a third. They gave up when the ground became too difficult for them to dig with hand tools. Now, already this story contains some red flags. The detail of the pulley seems designed to indicate that a treasure was buried there. But surely if someone were trying to hide a treasure, they wouldn't leave behind the pulley they'd used to lower it to mark the spot. Additionally, the detail that they could still see the marks of the original diggers' pickaxes after the hole had been filled in for perhaps 100 years must be further embellishment. An image meant to convince an audience that treasure was down there. But we don't really need to weigh the believability of the tale, because its lack of historical documentation makes it dubious from the outset. There's no record of this event occurring until the first accounts of the story in 1860s newspapers. Historians have attempted to verify the details, and all they've been able to confirm just further discredits the tale.
My understanding is that genealogical records have been established for McGinnis and for Vaughan, and that they were not children in 1795. They were in their 30s. And in fact, they owned land on the island before the date of the discovery. Most of the retellings of the legend claim that the island was uninhabited at the time that they made the discovery, which is not only false, but outrageously false. It just doesn't make any sense that no one would live on this island. My understanding is that there are land records that go back before that time, showing that people owned land and were frequently on that island.
And though, according to legend, these original treasure hunters would also be involved in the next few excavations, having convinced others of what they'd found, it is telling that neither the ship's pulley or any part of the oak platforms was preserved as evidence. Already we see that while elements of it may be accurate, key parts of the transmitted legend are demonstrably false, and this does not bode well for the overall reliability of the tale. Next came the early 19th century dig, funded by one Simeon Linds, a wealthy Nova Scotia local who was intrigued by the claims of McGinnis and Vaughan, gathered investors, and formed the Onslow Treasure Company. Accounts place this dig in 1803, or was it 04, or perhaps 02? 01? It's all rather vague, since again there is no primary source attesting to this event.
Personally, I think this dig is just a complete fabrication. I don't think it ever took place, because there's no evidence of it whatsoever. Basically, for anything pre-1860s or certainly before 1849, we have nothing. Really, all we know is there were some people whose names seem to match up with some of the people in the legend. They weren't kids. At least some of them are rumored to have participated in the later treasure digs in the early 1800s, or possibly the 1849 one. That would suggest that this is some sort of lifelong obsession for them, that they, wait years and mount this great effort to try to come back and find the treasure that they found as kids. There would be records of that. Why wouldn't they have written letters or kept diaries about these very memorable experiences? These are not kind of everyday experiences that people just have and then forget, especially if they continue to participate in treasure hunts over periods of years or decades. That meant that family members and friends would have known what they were up to. So why didn't their wives write a memoir, mention it in a letter, or give a newspaper interview or something like that?
Surely such a company with investors would have left some kind of paper trail, or might have been mentioned in area newspapers at the time of its formation.
The question of why are there no contemporary records, I think is a big one in this case. This is exactly the kind of thing that would have, and especially in the 19th century, newspapers or book publishers would have loved stories like this and would have been motivated to publish them. So the fact that they don't exist, I think, is significant. The later you get in time, the more documentation you would have, not less. The fact that there is no proof, I'm highly suspicious that this dig ever even took place.
According to the legend, which again did not appear for several decades, this company's efforts supposedly also resulted in some further tantalizing evidence that a treasure was buried below. They continued to find oak platforms every 10 feet. And since the claim is that they penetrated all the way to about 98 feet, this means they encountered some 7 platforms of oak logs, none of which were ever kept for study and proof. Just imagine, too, if this were true, What kind of an engineering feat is being attributed to pirates, or whoever supposedly left these platforms behind? They are said to have dug directly downward more than 100 feet with, we must assume, only rudimentary tools, and used a single tackle block on a tree branch to lower not just whatever chests are said to be down there, but also each and every oak log used in the platforms. It seems like a lot of strain on that poor pulley. The Onslow Company is said to have further discovered ship's putty, which sure must have been hard to discern among all that clay earth, as well as charcoal and coconut fiber. This last discovery seeming especially important since coconut was not native to Oak Island. But yet again, this purported evidence was not preserved except orally in the legend that would eventually be put down in writing, as if it were historical fact. Especially tantalizing was the reported discovery by the Onslow Company of an inscribed stone tablet at 90 feet. The earliest reports only indicate that a stone with quote-unquote marks was found at that depth. But this element of the story has taken on a remarkable life of its own.
One thing that's interesting about this inscribed stone, my suspicion is that there's been confusion about what the stone actually was, because the inscribed stone that was supposedly found at the Oak Island site was in fact not inscribed at all. H.L. Bowden examined it in 1909. This is listed in the source that I sent you, the Collier's Magazine article. And this is before the stone conveniently disappeared. He examined that stone, and he said there were not and never were any markings on it.
The legend has it that just beneath this stone, the Onslow Company diggers drove an iron bar 5 feet deeper before quitting for the day and felt it strike something wooden. For some reason, rather than assuming it was yet another platform, which he should have come to expect at about that depth, he believed he'd found a treasure chest that he would be able to dig up the very next morning. Why he wouldn't have just dug it up right then is another unbelievable part of the story. Instead, they all left, and when they returned, the hole was flooded to around the 40-foot level. No amount of bailing managed to lower the water level, so they tried to angle in downward from a second tunnel to the side, hoping to avoid whatever spring they'd opened. But this one too flooded, causing them to eventually call it quits. This flooding of the tunnel, which even 60 years later in the first known written accounts of the incident is portrayed as natural, would eventually become a major part of the legend that the pit had been booby-trapped with quote-unquote flood tunnels.
The flood tunnel is the linchpin of the whole story.
More on that later. What's interesting here is that after this supposed discovery of chests at 98 feet that the company was prevented from recovering by flooding, the legend tells us that the stone with strange markings was deciphered and that its message stated, quote, 10 feet down, 2 million pounds, end quote. Once again, like the pulley and the platforms and the coconut fiber, seemingly incontrovertible evidence of there being something down that shaft is cited, and once again, there's no proof that it ever existed. The translator of the marks on the stone is cited variously as a quote-unquote wise man, or a quote-unquote professor, or a quote-unquote cryptologist, but is never identified. One may find illustrations of the stone and its markings in books now, but this drawing did not appear until 1949, which is especially strange since by that time there had been a variety of other publications about the Oak Island legend, including a detailed quote-unquote prospectus produced by one later treasure hunting syndicate, and a 1936 article in Popular Science, all of which surely would have reproduced such an image. According to the few mentions of the stone in correspondence and in earlier versions of the legend, it was said to have passed between various people, being used as the backplate in a fireplace at one point, and being used as a hammering table by a Halifax bookbinder, until any inscription was conveniently destroyed. despite rumors that it was in the possession of a local historical society, there is some sense that it disappeared after 1912, if it ever even existed. The drawing just kind of manifested in 1949 in the book True Tales of Buried Treasure by Edward Rowe Snow, a historian of New England whose work can be honestly said to have some reliability issues.
I love Edward Rowe Snow. He wrote the kind of books that totally fire your imagination when you're about 12. It inscribes stones and old Indian camps and pirates and, Civil War derelicts and things like that. That was all his stock and trade. He was a folklorist, actually. I'm not even sure that I would call him a historian because he didn't really use critical historical methods in the same way that a professional historian would. He would just go and collect tall tales and then disseminate them. If somebody's grandpa told a story back in 1935 about a pirate who buried a treasure on an island off the coast of Maine, then Snow would put it in a book, and by putting it in a book, it would sort of acquire sort of the smell of history, even though it was just a tale told by somebody's grandpa. I actually investigated several stories from Snow's books for my podcast Second Decade, and then I also did a series of articles about some of his books on my old blog back in 2015. That blog's no longer online. But every time I drilled into something, a story that he presented, I found it to be false, or at least wildly exaggerated. Like, for example, his treatment of the disappearance of Theodosia Burr, which is a really interesting story, which occurred in 1812, 1813. So kind of how he does that is very typical, where he presents the facts, which are Theodosia Burr got on a ship and then the ship disappeared. And then he throws every folklore story he could possibly find about that event. And he basically throws that all on the table and says, you decide. There's no critical analysis. He just kind of leaves it on the table and walks away. I mean, he was this charming old grandpa who knew all the folklore is kind of what he was. So if he was around today, he would be classified, I believe, as a folklorist rather than a historian. Well, he would have been great on YouTube. Yeah, he would have been he would have a lot of subscribers on YouTube. In short, I don't trust anything that Edward Rowe Snow said or put in his books. In fact, I would go so far as to say that if a story appeared in one of his books, I would say it's probably safe to conclude that it's more likely not to have happened than it is that it did happen.
The drawing he put in his book appears to have been provided to Snow by a local reverend named Kimpton, who was writing about the legend himself and had been in correspondence with the current group of treasure diggers then searching the pit, who interestingly believed Kimpton's ideas about the money pit were inaccurate. Kimpton claimed in letters to have received all his materials from an unnamed quote-unquote minister who actually wrote his manuscript and, quote, did not give any proofs of his statements, end quote. Whether or not Kimpton actually drew the stone's symbols himself, as some believe, or actually did receive them from some third party, they are quite clearly a fraud, undermining many theories about the Oak Island pit that rely on examination of its symbols. Now for a brief intermission. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus. Every summer, I'm careful to avoid getting burned. My summer plans always include applying sunscreen so I can attend barbecues and protests without worrying about getting scorched. And when I make my plans by making phone calls, I also don't want to get burned by an outrageous wireless bill. That's why I switched to a Mint Mobile plan and saved enough to take a summer vacation. With Mint, I found no difference in speed or coverage, just a big difference in cost. And right now, you can switch to a Mint wireless plan like me to avoid sweating those surprise charges and overages. You'll just be chillin' with Mint's offer of 3 months premium service on the nation's largest 5G network for just $15 a month. With high-speed data and unlimited talk and text, it might just be the coolest thing happening this summer. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
Now, back to the show. The last of the treasure digs on Oak Island, said to have involved one of the 3 treasure finders, Anthony Vaughn, and organized as a treasure company with investors, again by the enigmatic wealthy local Simeon Linds, was called the Truro Syndicate, and appears to have formed around 1848 or 1849. This was the group that is said to have dug an entirely new shaft and used a horse-driven auger, which they claimed bit into both wood and metal, that encountered what they described as loose metals like coinage, and that pulled up a piece of gold chain. Interestingly, we do have some documentation of this dig previous to the 1860s newspaper accounts.
Of these claims, the only one that is supported by any sort of external evidence at all is the dig in 1849. But the only piece of evidence we have of that is a license of some sort that was granted to some treasure hunters by Canadian authorities. And that's all we have. We don't know even if the dig actually took place, just that a license was issued for it. It may have occurred because among the earlier pieces of documentary evidence is a newspaper account by a visitor to the island about 1857, noting that there were remains of some previous dig there. So somebody had been there before 1857. So it might have been the Truro Company or it might have been somebody else.
If we examine the claims made about this effort, we again see indications of embellishment. The first are the claims of what the auger encountered. It should be noted that they did not find treasure at 100 feet. As the phantom inscribed stone and the previous effort's findings would lead us to believe. And subsequently, later translations of the inscribed stone suggest it actually told of treasure to be found, quote, 40 feet down, end quote, indicating they just had to dig a bit farther, down to 130 feet. It was during these deeper diggings with an auger that a few links of gold chain were turned up, which certainly sounds impressive,
This is interesting because this is one of the things that we know absolutely did not happen. The source that I sent you, the Collier's article written by H.L. Bowden, who was the engineer on the 1909 dig, that's the one that Franklin Roosevelt was involved in. But he explains in that article the various borings that they did at that time. And he concludes specifically that no links could have been brought up to the surface by a flat chisel or an auger because they were drilling through 120 feet of water. That's the other thing that people forget. It had to come up through 120 feet of water, and he said there is no possibility that those supposed recoveries could have been made with that equipment.
And even if it were possible, when you read the earliest accounts, you find that these links were, quote, possibly from an epaulette, end quote. That means we're talking about 3 tiny links of a kind of chain that may have come off the clothing of any number of visitors to the treasure dig during the last 50 years. Likewise, in these later digs, anytime wood is encountered, it must be remembered that even according to the legend itself, the money pit had been the site of multiple dig operations that were later abandoned, and thus may have been full of the refuse from previous treasure digging attempts. This 1849 syndicate's claims that in addition to punching through an empty space, they drilled through wood and metal, including quote-unquote loose metals they took to be coins, can also be logically explained by the debris from the previous digs, judging only by the later stories told about them. Remember that they had supposedly dug cross tunnels in an effort to bypass the flooding, which would account for any voids the Truro Syndicate's shaft may have encountered. Additionally, there are reports that the platform and apparatus of at least one previous dig had collapsed and fallen into the pit, which accounts for further wood and metal that the Truro auger may have struck, including some quote-unquote loose metals, like chains.
So what we all have is now this bizarre spectacle of excavations being made by treasure hunters, which are then discovered by later treasure hunters who claim those excavations are evidence of the original treasure. This is one reason why this myth is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is not entirely clear how the operators of the Truro auger determined that they were actually drilling through these materials, though, especially the quote-unquote loose metals they took to be coins. According to the legend, they simply knew because of the sounds they heard and how easily their drill turned. The bit of gold chain it's claimed they brought up was in mud, but if this bit of gold was encased in mud, then it was not in a chest, or if the auger was able to pull gold chain up its length and mud aggregated around it along the way, then why were no loose coins ever likewise pulled up? The simple answer is that they misconstrued the sound. One 1861 letter written by a visitor to a later treasure dig at the site indicates that the soil being brought up by the operation then underway was mostly, quote, composed of sand and boulder rocks, indicating that the drill in 1849 may have encountered gravel. The sound of such loose stones being turned would certainly have struck the ear as sounding like coins, especially if that's what they wanted to hear. And interestingly, the very fact that gravel was encountered deep within the money pit helps to explain the flooding in the hole, and to dispel the notion that the flooding was due to booby trapping. Typically, the flooding is said to be unnatural because the earth was clay, and thus impermeable.
So the simple explanation is that the flooding that occurs in the pit is natural seepage. If you dig 200 feet down or even 50 feet down on a small island whose most distant point from the shore is only a few hundred yards, it doesn't matter where you dig, the hole is going to fill with water. The thing that baffles me about this case is I don't get how people don't understand this, because it's so simple. The usual objection is that, well, the soil is clay. Well, it's not. First of all, even if it was, it would still be flooding or seeping. But it's been proven time and time again that the geology of this island is far from what the legend claims it is.
The aforementioned 1861 letter from Henry Poole Esquire, the visitor to the later diggings, states clearly that, quote, the water course by which the original money pit was flooded is in all probability a layer of gravel creation, end quote. Gravel being extremely permeable. Really interestingly, the earliest mention of a flood tunnel booby trap theory appears in one of those later news articles, this one from 1861 and called the Oak Island Folly, which was actually ridiculing people who wasted their money chasing after a treasure on the island. In it, the author states that the theory on which these deluded people are proceeding is that the money had been buried and sluices or communications with the sea so constructed that the localities of the treasure was flooded while the vicinity was comparatively dry, end quote. It is unclear what vicinity is being referred to as dry, but here in 1861 we see the theory had already taken hold. Some of the claims of what the Truro Syndicate found appear to have originated from an anonymous 1861 letter, written by one, quote, Patrick the Digger, end quote, who claimed to have been part of the Truro dig and was responding to the derision of the recent article. Much of what Patrick states is just repeating what the news article had said about the claims of treasure diggers. Though when he mentions their boring through loose metals, he actually says, quote, coins, if you will, end quote, making explicit the claims that they had drilled through a treasure chest. And what happened to those chests at 100 feet? Well, according to Patrick the Digger, they dug 4 separate shafts, one on each compass point surrounding the original pit, and they dug deeper than the original pit's depth and dug directly beneath it, encountering no water at all. He says that what happened then was the treasure chests previously bored through, along with the water from the flood tunnel, crashed through into their new tunnel, filling it with water and soil. There are a few conclusions we can draw from this letter. One, if it were true, then the treasure was there at around 100 feet, not down 100 feet further near bedrock, as some later treasure hunters who dug deeper and deeper have insisted. And it would have still been present in the bottom of the shafts among a slurry of water and mud after supposedly crashing through. We can eliminate this possibility because not a damn coin of it was ever turned up by the many future treasure diggers who excavated and bored those same old shafts through the years. 2, if it were true that several other shafts were sunk on all sides of the original money pit to an even greater depth and beneath it, encountering no water, then it would seem to disprove the claim of a flood tunnel booby trap. However, it would also seem to disprove the notion that a layer of permeable gravel was present to allow water into the shafts. But we know that water has filled the pit, so we are left with a third and more convincing conclusion that the anonymous Patrick the Digger is not a reliable source. It must be remembered that all of these details about these digs, not only the original find by McInnes and the others, but also the Onslow Company effort and the Truro Syndicate operation, come to us through later newspaper accounts and dubious reports like those of the anonymous Patrick the Digger. Thus, we might look askance also at the further claim that the Truro Syndicate discovered further evidence of the flood tunnel in the form of drains on a nearby beach at Smith's Cove. According to the legend, one of the original pit finders, Anthony Vaughn, upon learning that the pit was filling with salt water, not fresh water, led the group there, having recalled seeing water, quote, gushing down the beach there at low tide, end quote. Investigating, they found that the beach was, quote unquote, artificial, with tons of coconut fibers beneath the sand, which, recall, is not native to the island, and 5 box drains or finger drains constructed with beach rocks. We know that these man-made structures actually existed, though, because geologists, both in the 1960s and the 1990s, confirmed the existence of both the coconut fibers beneath the beach and the drains. However, the findings of these geologists did not support the notion of a flood tunnel booby trap.
The first geological report was done in 1867. I know there was a geological report done in this century before the History Channel show started and found exactly the same thing that they found in 1867. So it's dig a hole on an island, it's going to fill with water. That's the way things work.
Geologist Robert Dunfield in 1965 determined that the Windsor limestone layer, which is honeycombed with natural water courses, intersects with the Money Pit, making the flooding an entirely natural phenomenon. Reports that the waters flooding the pit rose and fell with the tide were thought to indicate that it was coming from the beach through a tunnel, but its water level only moved around 1.5 feet compared to the 9-foot difference between high and low tide at the beach.
There are no flood tunnels. There's been not a single shred of evidence of them ever found. And you would think after 200 plus years and numerous digs that somebody would have located them by now, and they haven't. With all the attention focused on it, in 200 years you would have found, if there was a man-made channel or a series of man-made channels in there that was funneling floodwater to a specific point, it would have been easy to find them, not difficult. It would have been very easy to find them. It would not have taken you 200 years to find them. It would have taken 2 hours to find them, if they existed.
If the legend were true, and one could see all the water gushing out of the flood tunnel through the drains as the tide ebbed, then it would seem a simple thing to just wait for it to drain out, stopper the box drains, and dig away. But the fact is that it was flooding by a natural water course, not a tunnel connected directly to the beach. And simple logic tells us that no such flood tunnel could possibly have worked, not just because the engineering feat of cutting a drain some 600 feet from the beach to a treasure chamber would have been impossible, but also because no evidence of a constructed flood tunnel has ever been found. Such a tunnel would need to be lined with flat stones, for example, or cement, and would have been observable. Treasure hunters on Oak Island would have people believe that these tunnels were cut into bare earth, perhaps filled with beach rocks, but not lined. Such a tunnel, inundated by seawater daily for hundreds of years, would collapse, fill with silt, become clogged by mud. They simply would not work. Despite the fact that the flood tunnel theory is manifestly impossible, the presence of man-made structures at Smith's Cove and of what does appear to be an artificial beach have long puzzled those seeking to explain them. Indeed, for a long time, Smith's Cove seemed the only genuine mystery of Oak Island.
Clearly, it is interesting.
Now, though, that mystery has been credibly solved. Flood tunnel theorists claim the coconut fibers were laid out beneath sand to act as a sponge and direct water into the box drains.
These finger drains or box drains or whatever they're called, they don't connect to anything. If they were part of the flood tunnels, why wouldn't you just start at the box drain and then find the channel where it connects to the flood tunnel and then follow the tunnel? At the very least, the location of the box drain would point you to where to dig to find the flood tunnels, right? But no one's ever found anything because they don't connect to anything.
Since coconut fibers were long used as shipping material to pack cargo and prevent its movement, this notion went well with ideas about pirates or other early mariners having constructed the tunnels. Other notions have suggested that the island was used by smugglers and their packing materials were simply discarded on the beach, or that it came from shipwrecks in the distant past and was deposited there by storm activity, though these ideas did not explain the drains. Among the first theories to explain everything was that it was a kind of filtration setup to draw seawater toward a nearby well, turning it to freshwater. However, this was proven false by the existence of freshwater wells elsewhere on the island. Finally, in 2010, researcher Dennis J. King proposed the most convincing explanation that it was the remains of an ancient salt cooking operation.
So what these are salt pans. They're shallow structures that were dug on the beach into the sand and their purpose was to boil off large amounts of seawater to evaporate the seawater and extract the salt. The salt was used for preserving fish.
In my recent Blind Spot patron exclusive minisode, I discussed the early activity of European fishermen around the Atlantic coast of Canada. Some of these fishermen, specifically French and English fishermen, were known to land on the Canadian coast to preserve their fish before their return voyage by drying and salting them. And the very first owners of Oak Island in the 1700s were known to use it as a base of fishing operations. Back then, salt was not so very plentiful as it is today, and it was heavily taxed.
So Oak Island was a fishing site, possibly an illegal fishing site, or it may have been unregulated, but the salt operation was sub rosa because salt was taxed heavily in British colonies, and the fishers who were working there were trying to evade the tax.
In fact, a French salt tax is credited as one of the causes of the 1789 French Revolution. The solution for Atlantic fishermen was to cook their own salt, and indeed the structures at Smith's Cove bear some similarity to salt works in Japan and Normandy.
The proof positive that these were salt pans is because there's been several witnesses who claim that they found sort of reddish soil underneath these structures. And this exactly matches the pattern we see in other sites where salt was manufactured in this process. For example, East Anglia in England, there's a series of beaches that were used for this purpose for a long time, and the soil is this reddish color around where this was done.
This explanation actually accounts for both the drains and the artificial beach, as the seawater, controlled by a dike, is filtered through the sand and coconut fiber, the sand catching some salt and the coconut fiber removing sand and silt, whereupon the saltwater solution was carried through the drains to a hypothetical nearby well. Salt could theoretically be harvested and boiled from the seawater in the well, as well as from the sand, a more laborious process. While this explanation too is theoretical, it's a theory that accords with history and with geology. It's simply a far more trustworthy conclusion. So there we are. The legend, nearly fully formed already, with its claims about markers and booby traps, came to wider attention in the newspaper articles of the 1860s. Even though some of those earliest reports called the treasure hunt there foolish, further treasure hunting operations followed, as did further claims of evidence for the existence of some buried treasure there. The story then passed into folklore in the 20th century, when it was included in books like Edward Rowe Snow's True Tales of Buried Treasure, and this process would continue with the Rotarian and Reader's Digest articles, and would spread further in numerous anthologies that collected stories of supposed unsolved mysteries, books that were very popular for a long time.
I came across it in 1991, and it was in a book called The Encyclopedia of Unsolved Mysteries by Colin Wilson and Damon Wilson, published originally in 1987. It's been republished since then under a couple of different names, like in fact, I even have another version of it that's like the Mammoth Book of Mysteries, or something like that, with just like a potpourri of short articles about various things. There's lots of stuff in here that you've done or is definitely kind of in your wheelhouse. Marie Rogers, that's in there. Russian royal family, the Convulsionaires. Yeah, they're in there. In this book, there was the truly, woo stuff like Sasquatch and the Loch Ness Monster and, stuff like that. And then there were the more like kind of historically based mysteries like the Mary Celeste. But this Oak Island story was in that book. And I remember I came across the book because my roommate in college just had it on his shelf. And I'm like, oh, that looks like an interesting book. And I was very fascinated by the story. I was also credulous at that time. So of course, thought it was historically accurate. And I found out that there was a popular, I believe it was Popular Mechanics. It was either Popular Mechanics or Popular Science. One of those magazines had run an article on it in the 1930s. And my university library had a bound set of that magazine going all the way back to the beginning. So it was easy to pull off the books from the shelf, and I quickly found that article. And what intrigued me, even at that time, this should have been a red flag at the time, but the story, even the initial origin story that they told in that article, which I recall was from 1939, was significantly different than the story that was in the Encyclopedia of Unsolved Mysteries book. Every couple of decades, it resurfaces and it changes a little bit. And just to see how it's changed in the time since I discovered it, and now, with the wild claims of the Roman sword, the theories about the Knights Templar and Shakespeare's plays, and all of this garbage has been added to it. Even the book that I initially read back in 1991 was fairly well bounded in its suppositions.
The process of legend making would reach its apogee with the spread of the story on the internet and the absolutely pointless History Channel program. As I have shown, nearly every major claim related to the Oak Island money pit has been reasonably and believably refuted, and yet we haven't even really scratched the surface of this legend. We've only looked at the earliest of its stories, the tales told about digs that occurred before any known documentation. What about later findings? What about the claims of treasure hunters since? What about further evidence and artifacts said to have been found there? What about the videos that are said to prove there are treasure chambers and skeletons down in those depths? What about all the claims of landmarks and conspiracies promoted on the History Channel? And most importantly, what about the why? If this were all a hoax from the beginning, what was the purpose? All of these further mysteries I and Dr. Sean Munger will explore, like side shafts branching from the main borehole, as this series goes on. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. Thank you to our guest, friend of the show, Dr. Sean Munger.
Great, thank you.
Check out Sean Munger's podcasts, Second Decade and Green Screen, and go watch his videos on YouTube, in which he tackles a lot of pseudo-history and historical myths and misconceptions that I think you listeners will find very interesting. You can find him as Sean Munger on YouTube.
My new blog is at gardenofmemory.net, and my website, seanmunger.com, where I do have some online history courses. And actually, I'm going to be having more coming this year. So if you are interested in taking some in-depth online courses, that's been sort of in limbo for the last couple of years, but I'm ramping that back up. Also, I have a new book coming out. It's a mystery novel. It's called Daniel Vanished. It will be up on Amazon Kindle for pre-order by the time this episode airs. It's not up yet, but it will be.
Check out the blog post for this episode, which should go up on historicalblindness.com before the next episode releases, with a transcript, related imagery, and citations for further reading. As always, thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Sean Munger, Devlin Hoff, Michael Markham, Jessica Reeves, Fred R. Groteis, Robin Naggett, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliet O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Logan Houlihan, Lily Powers, John Gowen, Lonnie Coffer, Ralph Fenn, Ama, Kevin Osborne, Ed Shockley, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Jocelyn Clausen, and Lindsay McAllister. Thank you for digging with me deeply into these dubious stories about the past. Hopefully it's not too much of a bore, right? Get it? Hopefully it's not too boring, as in a borehole. There's something there. I'll workshop it. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and The Conspirators. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, don't watch the History Channel. They should really rename themselves the Hoax Story Channel. Hashtag Hoax Story Channel. Our hashtag's still a thing. Let's get that going.
Have you ever wondered how inbred the Habsburgs really were? What women in the past used for birth control? Or what Queen Victoria's 9 children got up to? On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. Join me every Tuesday for History Tea Time, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
If you like this podcast, can we recommend another one? It's called Big Picture Science. You can hear it wherever you get your podcasts, and its name tells part of the story. The big picture questions and the most interesting research in science.
Seth and I are the hosts. Seth is a scientist. I am Molly, and I'm a science journalist. And we talk to people smarter than us, and we have fun along the way. The show is called Big Picture Science, and as Seth said, you can hear it wherever you get your podcasts.